Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today, we're going to hear from some of Agrii's iFarms around the UK to find out more about this year's headline results and learnings going forward for 2024. Starting with a national overview from Agrii Seed Technical Manager John Miles. Firstly, can you tell us about the Agrii iFarm network?
So Tony, the iFarm network covers North Scotland down to Devon and Cornwall, and all points in between. National research centres as well, and they're really kind of a focal point for regional discussion to look at the work that we're doing, the agronomy guidelines that we obviously bring to customers, and things like varieties as well. And that culminates in visits to those iFarms, and particularly in the summertime as well, to stimulate discussion.
And John, from those iFarms and other technical centres, what did you see last year?
We saw quite a lot of similarity between North and South, which is not that often, particularly. But yeah, there was some real challenges with disease. So some varieties really had a terrible time and almost a 2012, and some varieties excelled within there. And we got good levels of disease, which is great for R&D, but pretty challenging for our customers.
You mentioned there some of the challenges, but what were the successes? What stood out?
The success stories were on a sort of genetics level, with the different risks and some very high disease risks. We saw varieties like Fitzroy and Champion and others with a very strong septoria resistance perform very well. We also saw pressure on grain quality in all of our trials, and that really underlines the importance. All of the facts really underlie the importance of variety choice at the beginning, because you never know how the next 12 months are going to play out.
And so, as we start our whistle-stop tour around the UK, let's first go to Kent and talk to the coordinator there, Neil Harper. So, Neil, hello there, and can you start by sharing with us how your season started last year for your iFarm site?
Down in Kent, on the trial itself, we got it in a good time, sort of the usual first week of October, which really went well. But the surrounding fields and, what you learn from drilling date down here is everyone last year got going a little bit earlier, looking at variety choice and the resistance and from the previous year's datas, and put it in. So what we saw was the ecstasies of the worlds and the more vigorous varieties got out the ground well, which moved us forward, where some of the slower ones took a bit of time. And I think last year we know that it was a drier autumn. There was a bit more challenge. We didn't have the stale seed beds. So we had a little bit more, probably a little bit more rubbish coming in the crops than we were anticipating, because we didn't get the spray off. So using the varieties, we saw that some of the more vigorous ones competed better with it, and where some of the slower ones let a bit of the rubbish come through. But on the other hand, in the spring, that puts more challenges with PGRs, disease pressures, with all the forwardness of the crop. So I think for me in Kent here, the drill timing, it was great to see crops getting away earlier last year, but just put a few more challenges, which is a good thing to build on for future years.
And Neil, you talk about the weather there. So how did the weather finally impact the yields down in Kent?
The site down here was not too bad. It's like everything with trials, you try and pick somewhere that you've got a very even and standard thing. So we had a good result. But the weather, having that drier autumn, which I spoke about, a bit more challenges with residuals and the seed beds. But moving into the spring, February was a fairly dry month down here, and we had a lot of applications going on. Then we turned into March and it turned a bit wetter. And we had some real cold and a windy period. So the challenges comes with timings. When these crops need their inputs, and us trying to think ahead probably by sort of 3-4 weeks what's happening and reading the weather, it can be a challenge. And that's the good and the bad of farming, really. We are dealing with Mother Nature at times to give this to us. So we found, trying to get the right PGR and learning on varieties, they all hit different growth stages at different times. So understanding what stage the crop was at, some were moving quicker, and also it stretched the gaps. So if we suddenly the plant came under stress and whatever disease, septoria, yellow rust, a bit of eye spot, or even nutrition deficiencies, the manganese and the zincs, getting the timing of these was sort of at times challenging. And at the end of the day, I think we probably saw that, with that bit duller and bit weather, we didn't hit maximum probably yield potential everywhere. And finally, we're in Kent, we're mainly a sort of a group 1 grower, group 2s. We have the milling markets. So we're looking at trying to get the milling market at the end, and trying to get the proteins was more of a challenge because we just had a period of dry weather at the end of the season. But as we know, we have to deal with what Mother Nature throws at us, but we definitely took a lot from the different varieties and how they performed in this variable conditions last season.
And Neil, from down there in Kent, what were the key lessons that you'd like to share with those who are listening today?
For me, I think probably keeping it simple is choosing the varieties. So let's take 2 extremes. We have Ixtaze and Dorsum. Ixtaze gets out the blocks and moves, Dorsum's a bit slower. So looking at putting that Dorsum in my earlier drilling slot, because it's a bit slower and I know it'll be slower to get going in the spring. And then the Ixtaze, it'll be in my later slot, because I know it's got the vigor, but it'll get going. Spreads my workload. I know where they are and where I've drilled them, and I can manage the timings on them varieties from what I know. So understanding what the varieties will be delivering and managing them accordingly.
Thank you, Neil. And let's now go to Banbury and the Winterton iFarms site and speak with the coordinator there, Sarah Hookway. So Sarah, perhaps you can share with us, how did the season start for you at your iFarm?
Cultivations were done in a timely manner, so we had a chance for blackgrass flushes if the weather turned wet. It was pretty dry, so we didn't get much of that. So this enabled us to drill the trials from the 13th of October, which we like to do a bit later on in the season, just to enable, or to make sure, ideally, to get a blackgrass flush beforehand. The crop was drilled, rolled, and pre-emergence went on soon after drilling. So we did have quite a good control of blackgrass in the autumn, established really well. Yeah, so by the 22nd of November, plots reached growth stage 13 and looked really good going through the winter.
Sounds good. So with the crop well established, what happened next?
In our area, it was a really dry February. Winterton has quite a high septoria pressure site compared to other local ones like Brackley. So it was looking good to start with, but then March hit and we had a lot of rain. It was extremely wet and a total of 143 mil of rainfall compared to an average of 30 mil for the last 4 years. And the last time we had this high rainfall was in 2018, which was another high septoria pressure year. So crops were looking good. There was septoria about, but obviously the rainfall with the latent period of septoria of 21 days, we started to see that later on through the spring. We do T0s on the farm because of this, and we did get that on the beginning of April. But because the conditions were quite wet, we had T1s didn't go on until about 4 weeks later, so we might have stretched that timing a bit. But between T1 and T2 was 3 weeks, so timings were pretty good after that to try and suppress the septoria.
So a high septoria year, how did the different varieties perform?
So from the trial results, the highest yielding varieties clearly showed that varieties with higher septoria resistance came up on top, basically. For example, Fitzroy was the highest yielding at Winterton, and then you got your classics like Ixtaze, Champion, even Zayat was up there. So it just goes to show treated yields. Some varieties you have to put more inputs in to get those yields, but it's well worth it.
And so looking forwards to this growing season, what did you learn from last year that you'd like to share with those listening today?
Variety choice, I would say, is key. We are seeing a lot more disease-resistant varieties being put in, but you still got your classics like Skyfall and Zayat, but they're more yellow rust prone, which we don't get as much on the Banbury site, but we still see it later on in the year. So yeah, variety, delayed drilling if you can, other than blackgrass. Yeah, and also timings of fungicides as well, to make sure they are 3 weeks on point. Obviously weather plays a part in that, but yeah, if timings are slipped, then the disease gets in there and it's harder to control. It's better to prevent than cure.
The Harvest 2023 iFarm Results Report is now available. Enclosed in this year's report, you will find information useful to inform future decisions on variety choice for disease, pest and lodging management. Also variety results on our winter and spring cereal and winter oilseed rape trials, as well as a special feature on drones in action and variable rate nitrogen with riser. Link in bio. And as we continue our UK tour of iFarms, let's now go to the Ludlow iFarm at Gatley Farms and talk to the coordinator there, Ben Burgess. So Ben, tell us a bit about how your crops were looking in the early spring.
Pretty wet, so we had a lot of rain up with us, which proved slightly challenging, but we did manage to get on our T-noughts. By the end of March, we were up to growth stage 25 to 30 for fairly high septoria levels.
And as each iFarm has its own focus depending on where it is located geographically, what is your focus there, Ben?
Ultimately our iFarm is wheat. It's wheat across the board. We are a predominantly feed wheat area, so a lot of feed wheat, and obviously the spend may be slightly less than some of our milling growers. So we are predominantly looking at BYDV because it went wet in certain locations because of trees, hedges, small fields, a lot of grass, and septoria. There are two main ones. Fusarium, because we have a lot of maize locally, so we obviously carry Fusarium. We need to be aware of Fusarium, and obviously we're seeing more eye spot, more stem-based disease. So we are increasingly looking at that as an issue and monitoring that at our site as well as others.
And so Ben, what would be your top tips going forward into this current season?
Imperative that you get the treatments and the timings correct rather than going by a calendar date, because in July, we had some pretty wet and windy weather. That Fusarium in the untreated plots did start to ramp up. We are seeing, I think the weather in our geography is dictating later drilling, but making sure the seed rate is correct for the time we are drilling. That's one of the key things we see out of the trials, that the seed rate is so important. 1,000 grain weight, knowing seeds per square metre at the forefront when we're drilling, not mauling the crop in.
Thanks, Ben. And now let's go to the north of Scotland to the Cromarty iFarm and speak to the coordinator there, John Mason. So, John, how did the season go for you?
So we started the season back in September 2022, and we got our oilseed rape and winter barley and wheat in the ground. We sowed our rape at the start of August. We sowed our winter barley at the start of September, and we sowed our wheat in the mid to late September. We then had a nice, reasonably nice back end, and the crops came away nicely. And then we had quite a wet and cold January, February, and then it started to dry up, and we had sort of a dry spell at the end of February, but then we hit a period of wet at the start of March, and that sort of hampered spring sowing. But then the crops came away and came into the spring quite nicely. We did see high disease pressure from that cold, wet winter, and due to early drilling, we found that crops were certainly wheat had septoria, and winter barley had Rinco coming out of the Rincosporium coming out of the winter, and then as the season went on, we were trying to keep septoria at bay, and then actually in spring barley, which is our main growing crop, we found that there was low disease pressure at the start due to the dry weather, but then later on we got dry weather that caused stress, and then after that we got a period of wet, and that then brought on ramalaria, and we saw high incidence of ramalaria in spring barley. But again, as I say, in wheat, high incidence of septoria, but on the whole, yields were pretty good and quality was reasonable. And we had some slight quality issues with spring barley, and the local markets changed their parameters to cope with that. But on the whole, we had a reasonable season with quite a few highs and lows, like you often do.
And what did you see in the results at the end of the season, John?
So from a wheat point of view, we found that due to the high septoria pressure, we saw big differences between varieties, and some varieties were coping with the pressure better than others, such as Dawson was coping with the pressure better than the likes of Skyscraper. Skyscraper is still a good variety, but a robust program is needed to help that. So Dawson came out top in our varietal yields in the Cromarty iFarm. But we also, with the varieties, we also have treatment. So we have an untreated farm standard tailored nutrition, and then a treatment on top of that. And what we found again, we found this for the third year running of a ton a hectare increase average across all the varieties, in using a tailored nutrition approach. So using tissue analysis that we have in partnership with Landcrop, we have our own guidelines, and we treat the crop according to what we are finding on a seasonal basis, and we are treating it at various timings. And when we took farmers through in the summer, you saw a visual cleaner crop and healthier crop, where we had done the tailored nutrition, because alongside a robust program, we have kept the crop healthier, and that has allowed the crop to flourish. And as I mentioned, the ton a hectare increase has shown that it is also economic to do so.
And from those results, John, what are you going to keep doing or do differently looking forward to this growing season?
So we're actually going to use the tailored nutrition as a farm standard, and then we are going to start to look at how we can then push yield on from that using other treatments, such as protected nitrogens in an amine form, and also in a polymer N form. And in the spring barley, again, we're going to look at the tailored nutrition, and also how we can, with the limited varieties that we have due to markets, we are seeing how we can get the most out of those varieties.
Thank you, John, for sharing your insights from the Cromarty iFarm up there in the north of Scotland. Let's now go back to John Miles for a roundup as to what we can learn from the iFarms across the UK, and what we can perhaps focus on to have even better results this current cropping year. So, John, what are your thoughts?
For me, if we look back at the season, it was one of those messages that we hear time and time again. Timing is everything. And the way that the weather played out, it really put pressure on timings, early fertilizer, and then we didn't get to follow up with PGRs and start the programs and the rainfall and things. So yeah, I think timing for me was the key thing, and not resting on our laurels and thinking, well, that's it, we're in for a dry spring, because it turned very quickly, and in many cases fell apart because of that timing element.
Well, thank you everyone for sharing some of the season's experiences, results, and of course lessons from your iFarm sites around the UK that can help us this season. And don't forget, the iFarm results report is available now. Simply click the link in the bio. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.